My story today is about my neighbor Frank. I lived on a small farm, and this was in the 40s, and Frank was my neighbor, and he was a bachelor farmer, lived with his elderly parents, and he did a lot of things. He had a small herd of cows, and he had a few hives of bees, and he refined his own honey and sold it. We still have a pail that says Frank Southern Honey on it. And he was really a good machinist. Neighbors had things break down, he could help them repair them. And for some reason, he had a friend who was flying those early airplanes in the 30s, and he thought he'd like to have an airplane of his own. But his friend was, unfortunately, the plane crashed and he was killed. He gave up any thought of flying. Well, of course, during World War II, there was a lot of publicity about airplanes, fighter planes, and young men flying planes. In fact, the plane that he decided to buy after the war was over was the Piper Cub. There was a Piper Airplane Company in Pennsylvania, and they made a light plane that had the wing overhead and the cabin underneath, and it really was a pipe frame with canvas stretched over it. One engine in the front, two seats, one in front of the other, so the pilot was in front and the passenger was in back, and they became very widely used during World War II as spotter planes. They would have a pilot fly it and an observer in the back with a two-way radio, and with his field glasses he would observe what was going on in the battlefield and radio back to headquarters so the correct decisions could be made. Well, these planes became available to the general public at the end of World War II. So somewhere in 1946, 1947, Frank was able to buy one of these planes. I think he bought it new. There were 12,000 of them used in World War II, so the company was really pretty good about building them, and they were economical. They were about the price of a new car at that time. So he had a long, narrow field on his farm, and he always wanted to fly, so he bought a Piper Cub. The first thing he did is build a hangar for it. Well, the hangar only had to be as big as the plane. As I remember, it was as wide as the wingspan and as deep as the tail. And it was just that, a T-shaped building where he could roll the plane in under cover. Then he set a pole and put a windsock on it. A windsock is a long fabric tube with an open end. And when the wind isn't blowing, it just hangs there. But when the wind blows, it goes out straight. And he learned to fly at the airport, county airport, and he used to take all the kids in the neighborhood for rides. I remember going up with Frank. Well, one day he went up and he had one of the neighbor girls, Susie, with him. And when he got to the end, he went to the end of the runway and he opened up the engine and he started off and he gained altitude, but not quite enough. And one of those wheels that hung down on a brace hit one gate post and it broke a brace, so the wheel just hung there and flopped. Wow. He'd made a big circle. Of course, Susie's parents are there on the ground. Made a circle, moved that little sliding window open, and says, "I'm going to the airport." And he slid it shut, and he went right to the airport where he knew if anything happened, there would be rescue people. And his parents drove to the airport. And when I called Susie, still alive, and I called her one day, and I said, "Tell me your impressions." And she said everything was fine. He was very calm. But just as we came in to land, he turned to me and said, "If anything happens to me, you open that window, dive out, and run like hell." So he came in and landed on one wheel, and it got slower and slower, and then he cut the engine, and it just flopped over, just like that. Nobody was hurt. The plane was later repaired, and he flew it for a long time after that. So that was my wonderful experience of having a neighbor who had his own airplane. I think as the years wore on and he got older, he got to the point where he felt that it wasn't safe to fly anymore, and he gave it up. But I'll always treasure those days, flying over the farm. I can remember this vividly, and my mother in the backyard, and we waved to her, and he tipped the wings, and my mother waved back. It was wonderful having a neighbor with his own airplane.